It's an interesting exercise to wonder what our world would be like had it not been for the colonial onslaught that so profoundly changed our generations. Those events that placed this portion of our story into motion, those events that call us now to work towards social justice. But is there something else to wonder? Something we have all been taught to believe is unthinkable? As with the 2 points that open my talk, I beg your indulgence if this is something that you have already heard before. What would we do if in the year 2020, only a couple years from now, this American culture was suddenly subdued by another culture that believed theirs was a superior way of living? Their God was the one true God, their language the only worthwhile speech, their history the only one that mattered. What would happen if this young American society, less than 250 years old, suddenly was rocked by cultural trauma? It's unthinkable, but let's suspend our disbelief for a moment to consider what would happen to our grandchildren's children if in the span of the next 50 or 60 years a killing blow was delivered to the way of life we now know. What would happen? What would we do? We could no longer speak the English language. Schools, businesses, stores, everything would be conducted in some new language we didn't understand. Our laws would be swept away. No more regulations, acts of Congress, municipal codes, no more executive tweets. No more laws as we now know them. No more doctrine of European discovery. No more American manifest destiny. Everything would be done according to some new legal system that we didn't understand and that was created and enforced in someone else's favor under a doctrine brought with them from some faraway place, a doctrine that conferred upon themselves the right, the power, the authority, the privilege to take what they pleased, to subdue, to dominate, to enslave, to teach. Our religions would be abolished. Bible studies and communion and concepts like American exceptionalism would be seen as prehistory, evil. There would be no more "in God we trust" on our money. In fact, there would be no more money. The new currency would be in the hands of others. Our bank accounts, our property, our belongings would suddenly be of no value to us, and most of our remaining wealth would be taken. Our standards of beauty would be ridiculed. Our art would be trivialized. Our literature would become folklore and superstition. Our philosophers and great thinkers would be described as unsophisticated, quaint storytellers. All of our place names would be changed. Our own names would be changed. We would be forced to celebrate peculiar holidays. We would be taught the exploits of someone else's heroes. Our children would be taken from us and sent far away where they would be forced to forget English, forced to dress in someone else's fashion, and forced to learn trades that prepared them for servitude. Taken from our influence, they would be given unpronounceable new names in a foreign language. They would not learn the history of their country, and they would receive the strong message that whatever they did, they would never be as good as those who were members of the newly dominant culture. Before long, no one would be learning English as a first language. Before long, our legal and educational and spiritual and social systems and beliefs would disappear. The day-to-day lives of your grandchildren's children would be characterized by unequal rates of incarceration, unequal rates of educational dropout, unequal rates of parental termination, unequal rates of suicide, addiction, poverty, depression, anger, shame, and all the other inevitable effects of cultural trauma. There would be no lack of reports and meetings and task forces and training devoted to addressing the problems of their failed assimilation. Unthinkable. A man by the name of Daniel Quinn is the author of Ishmael, The Story of B, Beyond Civilization, and many other books dealing with the Western form of society that has taken over our world. His words are quoted in uncountable sources, including one called Community Research Connections for Sustainable Community Development, which explains one of Quinn's most important concepts, that of totalitarian agriculture, which is defined as a destructive practice that subordinates all other life forms to the relentless, single-minded production of human food. In a paper published on their website, the assertion is made that totalitarian agriculture has never been fully and completely practiced in human society except by one culture, the Western capitalist society that has become the national and indeed the global standard. Quinn's book, which is paraphrased in this paper, explains that in totalitarian agriculture, food is not only fenced off to prohibit others from accessing it, but every species of animal, bird, or insect that persists in trying to forage in those fields are intentionally destroyed. Unsurprisingly, then, as this paper goes on to describe, a totalitarian form of agriculture produces food surpluses, resulting in agricultural domination that is used as a justification for territorial expansion, that in its turn justifies wars of domination and the destruction and enslavement of other cultures for the sake of expanding aggressive agricultural practices. To further this domination, other cultures are made to appear primitive, a term deliberately crafted and perpetuated in order to advance the Western culture's claim that indigenous people and people of color do not deserve the land from which they and their cultures emerge because they do not historically fence off food to prevent others from its access, and do not destroy the natural order by killing every other life form meant to coexist in the garden that comprises our natural world. This community research paper observes that the expansion of Western culture has continued unabated for nearly 10,000 years. As a result, totalitarian agriculture has invaded every single facet of our lives, of our history, and of our understanding of those terms. We are reminded that the agricultural revolution, the scientific revolution, and the industrial revolution were manifestations of aggressive agriculture. In fact, we see that obsession with fencing off food to produce crops for profit in our very own Alaska history of establishing farms and colonies where hunting and gathering once supported healthy indigenous populations. As colonial practice, tribal cultures that resist the concept of manifest destiny are converted or eliminated. And so we have come to this pass. In Western culture, the rich are rewarded for exploiting the poor. The powerful are rewarded for exploiting the weak. And totalitarian agriculture is the norm, not only for the crops this country grows, but as a symbol of Western culture itself. A defined characteristic of the practice termed industrial agriculture is that it is the dominant food production system in the United States, a fact agreed on by virtually every common source. This sort of food production requires heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. It practices the destruction of all other forms of life, and it normalizes isolation of our food. Perhaps there are parallels to the Western culture that gave rise to these unnatural practices. Perhaps imbalance, destruction, and isolation for the sake of profit are characteristics that reach beyond the industrial farmer's fields. Perhaps totalitarian agriculture is a metaphor for this Western society. Perhaps it is a cancer that seeks to kill every form of life that threatens its dominant position. Some years ago, I was a mentor for the low residency MFA program at the University of Alaska at Anchorage. Each year, every mentor and faculty offered a reading and talk at the annual week-long residency. One year, one of the other mentors was an author by the name of Craig Childs. He read a passage from his book, Apocalyptic Planet, that tells about a walk he took with a friend through a 600-acre cornfield in Iowa. 600 acres that were once tall grass prairie. 600 acres is about a square mile. As Childs describes in his reading, that's a big area when it's made up of row after row of identical corn stalks, all of them the same height, all of them at the same stage of growth, all of them an exact number of inches from one another, all of them seemingly isolated from other forms of life. No other life forms to be seen on or around them. Is that another metaphor for the dominant culture that has created the imbalance, destruction, and isolation of the culture we find ourselves in today? Childs describes his discovery of a tiny mushroom growing near a cornstalk. He remembers his thought at the sight of the tiny mushroom survivor. He says, "What else lived here? I lifted up the leaves, scanning the undersides near the stalks, and after several tries, I disturbed a small cobweb spider with a pearl of an abdomen hanging from its thimble-sized web. I caught it sucking juice from a captured crane fly. It quickly retreated into the seam of the leaf, which I lowered, giving the spider back its meal." Childs tells the reader, "These fields are managed for maximum yield, and anything but corn or soybeans in their plots is considered rogue and either destroyed or prevented from growing. There were originally 300 species of plants in the tall grass, 60 mammals, and 300 birds. Kinds of insects numbered over 1,000. Craig Childs says that nosing along the ground, he found one busy red mite, the size of a dust mote, hurrying across barren earth, up and over shredded pieces of old corn cob. It felt like another planet entirely," he says, "a bizarre world of little nomads at the base of monumental corn stalks. There was an ant, too. It was so small, it couldn't be pinned to a specimen board." Craig tells us that industrial agriculture miniaturizes species, allowing in only that which is very small or uniquely adapted. He tells about an early afternoon when they walked into an agricultural drainage, a swath carved from the middle of the field. Pheasant hunters call those things sloughs, gaps in the corn where you can get a shot off rather than in the tangle of standing corn. It was a dry river of waist-deep grass winding north to the south, the first open breath under the sky. Among nodding foxtail, clouds of grasshoppers sprang ahead, hundreds of them clicking to the air. The open sky was strange, prismatic, as if sunlight were passing through white glass. There were no bees, but I did see a delta-winged katydid, he says, clutched to a grass stem and a black stink beetle trundling along the ground. The vast majority of living, moving things were grasshoppers, and they were everywhere in this open passage. Craig said he'd never seen so many, as if this were their refuge. Childs leads us to a refuge unexpectedly discovered in the middle of totalitarian agriculture. In an industrial cornfield doused with chemical fertilizers and pesticides, where most other forms of life are attacked or destroyed, a field that is made inhospitable, isolated, unbalanced, unnatural, what shall we be? Shall we be a tiny mushroom survivor? Shall we be a red mite, an ant? Shall we find a refuge and become grasshoppers? Shall we aspire to be a cobweb spider with a pearl of an abdomen hanging from its thimble-sized web? My grandmother's name was Ruth Willard Hayes. She chopped wood for the cook stove and washed clothes with a scrub board. She rolled a scarf around her head, picked up a knife, and went to work sliming fish. After putting me to sleep, she bathed herself, and the next day she powdered her face while I watched. She drew eyebrows atop brilliant, knowing eyes and reminded me from my first day, be prepared. Don't let anything surprise you. You must be willing to face every threat. For the first few years of my life, I lived with Saudu while my mother was in the hospital. During those years, my grandmother taught me how to see the world. She taught me how to listen to the spiders in our house, for they knew things that I should know. During summers, I sat on the hill behind our old house and waited for her to call me in for soup or send me on a chore. Spring was not much different from winter. In winter, I listened for the Taku wind and hoped for a sled to ride down frozen Capitol Avenue. Inside the house, I stayed away from the snow that drifted under the door into the dark hall. I sat in the kitchen and with my grandmother waited for my grandfather to come home. We both wondered what mood he would bring with him through the door, with the drifted snow, with the wind, with a wide smile carrying gifts, or with a cold grip on a cheap bottle of something to help him forget. Winter in Llingit Oni brings magpies and ravens. Eagles allow themselves to be more freely seen. We take measure of the wood, we sweep the stove, we unpack blankets from their summer store. We watch the mountains and the birds for marks of early snow. We wait. Unlike spring, winter does not bring more signs of spiders into the house. Like the bears, they must be holing up somewhere, or dying, or dead. My grandmother instructed me about spiders. Don't hurt them, she warned. Learn from them. Watch them. Learn. Spiders hunt. Although we might consider them bashful around humans, they show no such timid spirit with their prey. Even the web spinners remain at the ready, testing their woven silk for the struggles of unwary victims. Though their size is small, their nature persuades us to boldness. Spiders greet the world early. They wake and get busy early in the day and early in the spring. While the more familiar admonition for those who would lead a correct life is to wake before the ravens, rising before the spiders behooves us even more. The industry of spiders exemplifies right living. In the garden, spiders occasionally mimic the colors of nearby blooms. Their sly lurking reminds us that boldness and industry will suffer from an absence of cunning. When still a newly married young woman, my grandmother traveled to Klukwan to visit her dying sister and retrieve the youngest child, a fresh-born girl named Kahkwe. With the child, my grandmother and her new husband, Ernie, traveled back to Juneau. In 2 or 3 years, my grandmother's first natural child was born. She eventually gave birth to 3 boys and 2 girls. 1 baby boy died, and she and Ernie began to drink. Spiders are persistent. One sleepy morning, years after I had begun teaching my own grandchildren about spiders, as I waited for warm water from the faucet in the hand sink, I glimpsed a spider whirling down the drain. I washed my hands at another sink and told myself there was nothing I could have done. I promised myself and the spider that from now on I would more carefully attend to the presence of other lives. Normally, I trap spiders in a clean glass jar, blocking their escape with stiff paper forced at the feet of their panic, and release them onto the wet ground outside the front door. I send them all away with my good wishes. Now, I mourned my role in one spider's death. I imagined its headlong rush into the dark, churning void. But what could I have done? I asked myself in hopes of absolution. My grandmother's words held no room for pardon. I could have been precise. I could have watched. I could have been mindful. Hours later, I braved the hand basin again, just in time to witness that spider summiting the drain's final climb. Without a moment for rest, she began again her labor to overcome the sink's smooth walls. While I retrieved a sparkled glass and picked through recent cardboard, I thanked her for the lesson. She had reminded me to persevere. My grown son does not share my consideration of spiders. He smashes them if he thinks I'm not looking. Otherwise, he calls for me or my granddaughter to trap them. He hasn't the patience to listen for the stories they tell. My grandmother's oldest child, the baby girl she'd retrieved from Klukwan, grew into a good worker. She worked at the city cafe and in the hospital. She got pregnant. She remained unmarried and gave birth to a baby girl. My grandmother disapproved, but the grown daughter did a lot of work around the house and paid a lot of the bills and bought a lot of the groceries, so my grandmother could only yell, scold, and wait for my grandfather to come home either drunk or sober. The grown daughter got tuberculosis and was sent to the hospital. My grandmother fit the new baby into her life. Spiders exhibit qualities to which I can only aspire: patience, determination, common sense. I don't know what my grandmother must have meant for me to learn when she taught me not to disturb spiders I discovered crawling along our wall or scurrying into corners. I know now that by teaching me to respect this one small creature's life, she taught me reverence for every living thing. By cautioning me to listen to spiders, she taught me to listen to the world. I don't flatter myself that my own grandchildren pay any more attention to my admonitions than I did to my own grandmother's lectures at the time. But I do believe that one day they will remember me as I remember her, teaching me in a voice of scolding grandmotherly love, ready to dance with me, ready to answer any question, ready to watch with silent wisdom while I listen for the whispers of others. After the oldest daughter came home from the hospital, after all the children were grown or dead, after everyone had finally moved out and my grandmother found herself alone in the old house, she and her new man rented an apartment closer to town and drank most of the time. He often raised his hand to her. She wrapped herself in a knee-length coat and covered her face. When a young girl ran into the ground floor apartment to visit her grandmother, he held back his raised arm and turned away. She shapes her web. She drops herself with utmost faith into the abyss. She and her sisters hang themselves from the ceiling here and there. They focus themselves against the light. I sweep the hint of their shadows from my cheek. I come across them on the walls and find them crawling in slippery circles in the tub, unmindful of the coming flood. I retrieve a sparkled empty glass and pick through recent papers for stiff board. She senses me and tries to flee, but where can we run when we're trapped by porcelain walls? When her oldest daughter, the one she had retrieved from Cluckwan, the one who didn't know she was her mother's natural child, she was not her mother's natural child until one thoughtless moment when the knowledge was thrown at her across a room, across a fracture, across a broken life, left the state vowing never to return. My grandmother carried on with the rest of her life until one cold day in the midst of a Taku wind, when she walked south on South Franklin Street instead of in the northern direction that would have led her quickly home. 2 weeks later, her oldest daughter forced her eyes to read the unwanted words in the unwelcome letter from a younger sister telling her of her mother's lonely death. Found on the ground in the cold winter, found wrapped in a knee-length coat, found alone. She shapes her web, spinning one line, drops herself into the unknown, is swept unmindfully from unseeing faces, finds the smooth destination, slips repeatedly from smooth, unforgiving walls, is flooded into the dark, clinging by desperation alone against the circle's side. When at last the flood ends, she climbs toward the light, only to be caught beneath the transparent glass and forced upon the cardboard, is carried into the cold, is dropped without ceremony onto the pebbles, the clover, the dirt. She overcomes every danger. She allows nothing to surprise her. As my grandmother always knew, we must be like the spider from our first day to our last. We must be willing to face every threat. From Ben & Jerry's to Harvard, people, companies, corporations, universities, social justice organizations, and too many others to count have begun to lift arms in solidarity. Perceptions of justice may differ, but it's not difficult to recognize that we live in a culture founded on genocide and made wealthy by slavery. We can see the social inequities produced by a belief in manifest destiny. We cannot argue with the realities of the society in which we live. We can, however, ask ourselves a question to help us see even more clearly. If we set out to build a racist society, what would it look like? What would a society built on racism look like? Let's think about that question. Discrimination and marginalization would be key features in a racist society. People of the dominant class would rarely witness or even be aware of lives that are lived on the margins. And when they saw discrimination, they would not easily recognize the phenomenon so common to people who do live their lives on the margin. An example is poverty. In the United States, people of color experience poverty at a rate approximately double that of the average for people of the dominant class. Forced to work more hours for less pay, people of color have less time to devote to their families, less time for education, less time to struggle out of poverty. Unemployment rates for people in poverty approximately double that of the dominant class. Poor people have to work 2 or 3 jobs to afford the rent that drifts up to the pockets of the already rich. That's how the system works. Poverty would be a key feature in a racist society. How about education? What would the characteristics of an educational experience be in a racist society? It's no secret that large gaps remain when we compare high school and college dropout statistics. Educational inequities is evident in the scarce number of minority teachers, judges, lawyers, doctors, and other professionals when compared to that of the dominant social class. This circumstance perpetuates inequity and results in the image of authority figures who do not reflect the population. This imbalance of authority would be a key feature in a racist society. It's easy to think that in Alaska, health care is not unequal. We all know that Indigenous people can go to SEARCH or Mount Edgecombe, the Alaska Native Health Consortium. But who would not trade that so-called free health care for equitable statistics with regard to diabetes, alcoholism, depression, prenatal care, newborn complications such as low birth weight, and issues associated with such characteristics as domestic abuse and suicide? A disparity in health problems and services would be a key feature in a racist society. Wealth disparities are a key feature of a racist society. White families own a disproportionate share of the national wealth. Studies have estimated that for every $100 white families earn in income, families of color earn approximately $60 or $70. That phenomenon is not accidental. It was built into the system we live in right now. In the system we live in right now, children of color are more likely to be identified as troubled, more likely to be suspended, more likely to be referred to law enforcement, more likely to be irrevocably placed into the school to prison pipeline. This phenomenon is not accidental. It was built into the system we live in now. It's not a surprise, then, that in our criminal justice system, people of color are overrepresented in courts and in prisons. Some have noted that the slavery upon which this country built so much of its wealth changed to Jim Crow and then to mass incarceration. When we look at the statistics, it's clear that incarceration rates are built into the system we live in right now. Racism is systemic. Colonialism is an act of cultural violence that pursues and perpetuates subjugation as its primary goal. A society built on a belief in manifest destiny, a society that allows schooling to perpetuate the image of primitive others, a society that tells itself that anyone can succeed if they just work hard enough, a society that tolerates Black men being shot in the street, Black children being shot in the streets. A society that tolerates the impact of that subjugation, imposing arbitrary constraints on meaningful indigenous values that were developed over hundreds of generations, replacing successful systems of education developed over those many generations, erasing accurate methods of history keeping, of beneficial health systems, of vigorous trade practice, all those social institutions that had allowed a sophisticated, healthy, vibrant culture to flourish for thousands of years. That subjugation, that colonial impact has carried out its intended purpose. It has resulted in disproportionate rates of Alaska Native high school and college dropouts, disproportionate rates of Alaska Native poverty, disproportionate rates of Alaska Native substance abuse, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, self-abuse, suicide, just as colonialism is intended to do. A racist society that was built long ago but continues its work perpetuates that inequity. We are here to decide what steps we can take to cure those evils. Our basic human understanding, a natural part of our human awareness, one that humans have been socially trained to deny in this culture, is that everything around us is alive. Everything possesses life and is full of life, full of spirit, full of energy. We are part of a life-possessing world. We are part of a life-possessing garden. Earlier, I asked this question. In an industrial cornfield doused with chemical fertilizers and pesticides where most other forms of life are attacked or destroyed, a field made inhospitable, isolated, unbalanced, and unnatural, what shall we choose to be? We might decide that we are that tiny mushroom survivor, a trailblazer in an environment in which we are not meant to thrive. Or shall we be a red mite or an ant, representing our larger community, making ours a productive life so those others who watch us will follow? Shall we build a refuge and become grasshoppers in such large numbers that someone will say they have never seen so many of us before? Shall the slough we build be so inviting, so open, so honest, so right, that others are drawn to the equitable place that we have built? Shall we be a spider, persistent and determined? Shall we spin our lines, drop ourselves into the unknown, even when swept away by those who don't acknowledge us? Shall we slip ourselves again and again away from those smooth, unforgiving porcelain walls? When we are flooded into the dark, when we cling by desperation alone, when at last we find strength to resist the flood, shall we be the ones who climb toward the light? When we are carried into the cold and dropped without ceremony, shall we be the ones who overcome every danger? Yes, we will allow nothing to surprise us. We are willing to face every threat. We are here to join hands and work toward an equitable shared future. We are here to build my grandmother's garden. Let's get started. Gonna teach.